The treasurer's race will be upon us on Friday. We thought it was important to go ahead and lay out some markers as an administration on where we are with regard to what we believe to be an incredibly important role in determining what comes next, not just with what happens here in Columbia, but frankly what happens throughout the state. And on that, I guess I've got three different thoughts. One, I want to publicly thank Kim Wingate for doing an absolutely superb job over roughly the last 6 weeks since we unfortunately had to suspend Thomas Ravenel from the treasurer's position. I think stepping in the crisis situation that he stepped into, he just did a superlative job of seamlessly managing the functions that the treasurer's office handles on a daily basis. I don't think we ever had I guess we didn't ever have a vote on budget control. We never worked together on the budget control board, which is obviously another function of the treasurer's office. But in terms of handling those day-to-day operations, he did an exceedingly good job. And I want to publicly thank him for that job that he's done for the people of South Carolina. And I would ask that folks, when they run into him in the Columbia environs, that they make it a point to pat him on the back and give him a thank you, because he was true public service. The question, though, is really on what comes next, and that's ultimately what Friday's about. And so I want to offer a few comments and a few thoughts that have nothing to do with current folks who may be jockeying for that position on their merits or demerits. This is not about them, but it's about the thoughts of the administration on the process at large. We think it's very, very important that whoever comes next, one, continue this process of reform that has been begun, particularly with regard to the Budget Control Board. You look at this Gear report, about $500 million in hypothetical savings being enumerated there. We have a genuine opportunity to continue some reforms that I think are very, very important to both the cost of government in South Carolina and to the efficiency of services offered by government in South Carolina. I think it's also important that we have somebody who's a really strong conservative steward, if you will, of taxpayer resources. There are about $15 billion in funds flow in and out of the Treasurer's office, about $7 billion in investments, about $8 billion of bonds that get checked off over at the Treasurer's office. And we think that notion of conservative stewardship continues to be very, very important. And we think it's very, very important that the next Treasurer lead on what will become a crisis, and that is this issue of unfunded liabilities. We have, both through OPIB and through the retirement system, about $18 billion in unpaid for political promises that really ultimately have to be dealt with in the long run. Ultimately, how that gets dealt with will be done through the legislative process, but we need someone who will actually speak out on the need for reform and change on those fronts if we're ever going to confront what are somewhat prickly political issues as you look at those contingent liabilities. And so it's with that thought in mind that we think it very, very important that as we go through this election process on Friday, that the General Assembly not restrict itself to looking inside the Assembly itself for candidates. You got about 170 folks inside the system. You got about 4 million people across the state of South Carolina. We think that there are a whole host of very talented folks outside of, the General Assembly itself who could fulfill this role as treasurer. And we also think that it's really a historic opportunity to right what I would consider to be a 130-year wrong, which is not having any black constitutionally elected officer in roughly 130 years in South Carolina. Not since the Constitution of 1895 have we had diversity with regard to constitutional officers in terms of race. And I think that what this election really represents is an opportunity to change that, in keeping with the three other things that I listed earlier. And so with that in mind, Tim Scott, who's in the back corner, I want to make very clear that, there are a whole host of different talented folks out there, but right now there's only one that's running. And Tim Scott has jumped into this race. I want to be clear on this administration's endorsement of his candidacy because, he's been county council, I guess on county council since 1995. He's been chairman of county council down in Charleston County for the last 3 terms. He, if you look at, they've got about 3,000 employees down on council. They've got about a $300 million budget down that way. He's dealt with some fairly large numbers in that equation. He's been 15 years in the financial services business, and in that process has managed a good portion of the assets for about 2,000 families and businesses. He has been co-chair of the Financial Services Committee of the National Board of Allstate, which is a Fortune 50 company. He's the treasurer of Wilbur St. Francis Hospital Foundation, etc. And again, I think that this race really represents an opportunity to go outside of our fold here in Columbia. And I think Tim's candidacy is particularly compelling on that front, and would encourage folks, whether on the House or Senate side, to give him a very, very strong look, given his background, given his professional expertise, given where he wants to go. That's on the issue of out. If the General Assembly remains somewhat committed to looking inside the system, then I want to be equally clear that if they're not going to look out, and they're going to instead look at just sort of current members of the General Assembly, that, we would endorse Greg Reiber. I did so in the primary back when he ran in the Republican primary back in when was it last year? It all blends in together. I guess roughly summer of last year. And I think he's got a compelling background from the standpoint of growing a small business over 20 years, consistently standing up as a steward for taxpayer funds, a whole lot of different ways, both there in the Senate, and really highlighting this issue of an $18 billion problem with regard to contingent liabilities in retirement health care systems. And so I just wanted to lay out those different markers. If we look out, again, we strongly endorse Tim and his candidacy. If the General Assembly is going to look exclusively in, then we think that Greg Reiber would be great, and endorse him for that reason. That's sort of where we are, and would open it up for any questions from y'all's standpoint. And then I might call you up in just a couple of seconds, Tim, just to maybe have some questions as well.
Governor, do you think your endorsement or endorsements will have much of an impact? From what we're hearing, pretty much people seem to have their minds made up or have committed to one candidate or another.
Well, that's what's been unusual about this race. I mean, it's been very, very quick. And what we're asking is, can we be a little bit more deliberative in this process? I mean, if you have something that hadn't occurred in 130 years and you have a chance to change that, wouldn't this be a good opportunity in which to do so? There's a natural proclivity for friends to support friends in General Assembly matters. We get that. We understand that. But given the historic backdrop that we're talking about, and given the amount of money that we're talking about, whether the $15 billion of throughput or the $18 billion contingent liability, we think it's important, as dear as friends may be on the General Assembly side, to stop and say, is this really what makes sense for South Carolina at this particular moment?